Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Supreme Court case overview video. In this video, we'll be covering probably two of the first court cases you remember from the entire year, and that's McCulloch versus Maryland and U.S. versus Lopez. These cases are all about federalism, and more specifically, they're about that battle between the federal government and the state governments where each one tries to stretch their powers. Remember, there are multiple clauses in the Constitution. We tend to focus on four: the Supremacy Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, the Commerce Clause, and the 10th Amendment. And these clauses really set up a battle between the states and the federal government with not so much clarity, other than what the Supreme Court can interpret for us, about who should win out at certain moments. And these courses are two of the biggest ones in clarifying just how much the states and the federal government can stretch their power before we have some issues. You see, essentially, if we were to look even more specifically, we can really see the tension between the Necessary and Proper Clause and the 10th Amendment. More specifically, the Necessary and Proper Clause says exactly what it sounds like it says, which is that Congress, according to Article 1, can do what is necessary and proper to keep the United States running. Remember, the difference between the Articles and the Constitution was that the Constitution gave broad power to this new constitutional system for the U.S. federal government to do what needed to be done. And as part of the compromise with the Anti-Federalists, the Bill of Rights was passed. And the Bill of Rights included the short but sweet 10th Amendment, which basically stated that everything that's not mentioned in the Constitution directly goes as a power over to the state. It's reserved as a power for the states. And that sets up an immediate gray area, doesn't it? If Congress has some powers that maybe are not directly stated but are necessary, does that make it a Necessary and Proper Clause power, or does that mean it's reserved for the states? Maybe it means both. We'll look at two cases here that really tested when these two clauses and the others we already mentioned interact. The first, of course, is the 1819 case of McCulloch versus Maryland. It's one of the first major Supreme Court cases, and it all started with the Bank of the United States. Maryland decided to pass a tax on the Bank of the United States, and I often tell students to think of the piggy bank when they think of McCulloch versus Maryland, right? What were they trying to do? How do you get the money out of a piggy bank? You got to break the bank. And Maryland was trying to break the Bank of the United States so that the State Bank of Maryland could be more successful. However, the Supreme Court said that this was unconstitutional. And it was unconstitutional for two particular reasons. The first being the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause prevents states from moving up the ladder. We have at the top the Constitution. The next rung below on the ladder is federal law, and the lower rung is state law. States cannot interfere with, of course, the Constitution, but also with federal law. And by taxing the Bank of the United States, Maryland was trying to interfere with the federal policy. However, the Constitution does not say that Congress can actually make a bank. So what the Supreme Court is also doing here is they're saying that Congress can make that bank by way of the Necessary and Proper Clause. And that brings us to the significance of this case. It created, or maybe we would say confirmed, the existence of implied powers. Remember, the Constitution does not say Congress can make a national bank. However, in this case, the Supreme Court said that the national bank was legit. And part of why it was legit was the Necessary and Proper Clause, which implies that Congress may have other powers other than what is just listed in Article 1. This became a very strong argument, particularly when we combine the Supremacy Clause, Necessary and Proper, and the Commerce Clauses, which seem to suggest that maybe anything that has to do with money, Congress can do it. And so Congress got very creative at justifying a lot of different laws. And it wasn't until 1995, almost 200 years later, that there actually started to be some pushback on this. See, what happened was, in the case of U.S. versus Lopez, Congress had passed the Federal Gun-Free School Zones Act. And a young man named Lopez in the state of Texas was prosecuted under both Texas and federal law. Texas decided to drop their charges to help fight what they saw as an unjust use of federal power, the Federal Gun-Free School Zones Act. In fact, the Supreme Court agreed. They said the Constitution does not give the federal government power over schools. Schools are not mentioned in the Constitution. Therefore, they are not to be regulating what goes on school grounds. You see, what the Gun-Free School Zones Act did might have had the best intentions, but it was the federal government overstepping into a realm that belonged to the states. Now, the US government had tried to justify this with the Commerce Clause, but the Supreme Court didn't buy that argument. They said there's really nothing about bringing a gun to school that has to do with interstate commerce. So what this did was it expanded powers of the states. It limited powers of the federal government. And that is the significance of this case, because that had not happened in a very long time. Really, especially since the days of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when the federal government grew it to an immense size in order to try to fight off the Great Depression, the Supreme Court had upheld time and time again Congress passing sweeping legislation into things that historically belonged to the states. But this case limited the federal government's ability to do that, particularly due to the Commerce Clause. So that's what we're going to want to remember as the significance. One final note, sometimes the necessary and proper clause is called the elastic clause. And with this image, it might be helpful to think of maybe a rubber band. The idea is that Congress's powers definitely can stretch. They are elastic, but even that rubber band eventually will snap. The necessary and proper clause does stretch Congress's power, particularly in addressing crisis. I think we've all seen that with the coronavirus. However, those powers can only stretch so far. Still, many things, for instance, mask mandates, have been left up to the states. It's a good example of how Congress's powers can stretch, but only so far. The states do maintain a great deal of power in our federal system. Finishing up here, how might you be expected to apply these cases? On FRQ3, you are often asked to take these cases and apply them to another ones. A couple of ideas. First and foremost, the Supreme Court has used the Commerce Clause in many surprising cases. If you start doing some research on the Interstate Commerce Clause, you may be surprised to find just how wide a range of times the Supreme Court has said the Commerce Clause is relevant to what Congress was trying to do. Up until 1995, that usually worked out in favor of Congress. Secondly, we ought to remember the process of devolution, and under President Ronald Reagan, the new federalist system where more and more states are getting more of the power and the federal government has been reined in. And the Supreme Court has played a large part in upholding those limitations on the federal government. So perhaps you'll get a case after U.S. versus Lopez that represents that reining in by the Supreme Court of the federal government. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you found this video helpful. Best of luck and have a great day.